Today we're going to be talking about how to successfully operate your first rental property, or maybe even your second or third, and make sure you get a good tenant in there that's paying your rent and not destroying things. So the first thing to keep in mind is obviously you want to have a property that's rentable. It's in rentable condition. When people walk in, maybe it's not the most remodeled thing in the world, but they come in, it's a nice place to live, and they can see themselves living there for, a year or two. And obviously you're going to have someone run the numbers for you. If you've ran the numbers and you've seen the rental comps, then you can get X amount per month, and it makes sense financially for you to rent out the property. If you haven't bought a property yet and you're actually looking to buy a property, make sure you let your lender know that it's going to be a rental property. You're not going to be living there because they change, their rates, how much down you need. There's a common misconception that you can come in and buy, 3% or 5% down, and you're not even going to be living at the property. That's not true. I can tell you that right now. A lender is going to be able to tell you more information. So the first thing you need when you're going to be renting your property out is an application. So you can get an application from a couple of different websites. Tenants will fill out the application, which includes, really important information. The biggest thing to look for is number one, being credit. You want to see that the tenant has a good credit, good history. Number two would be their income. Number three would be if they have any, prior evictions or anything like that. Another good thing to see on the application would be if they've had any bankruptcies, and you'll be able to see that if they've had anything in the last 7 years. So for credit, usually I like to screen tenants for 600 or higher. You can be a little bit lenient on the credit if you're renting out government subsidized housing like Section 8, where you're getting the rent guaranteed from the government. In that case, you can do a little bit less credit. If they're kind of on the border here and there, maybe an option would be to charge a little bit additional security deposit. I've done that with my clients before, where I help them, get additional security deposit from someone who's, right there on the edge. Income, really what you want to see is 2.5 times absolutely minimum. If you're renting out a property, it costs, $1,200 a month to rent that property out. Ideally, you want that person to be making $3,000 a month. Anything less than $3,000 a month, you're taking on a lot of risk as a landlord. They might not be paying your rent if they're only making $3,000 a month. They might be putting that money towards other things. So really, 2.5, ideally you want 3 times. If it's an easy property to rent out, you want 3 times or higher. And then in terms of prior evictions, make sure they don't have any prior evictions or bankruptcies. So paperwork, this is the next part right here. The paperwork you want to have for your rental property, obviously it'll vary from property to property. If you have a pool on the property, you're going to want to make sure that you're protected from a liability standpoint, if someone slips and falls or something like that. The biggest thing that you want to have, obviously, is after you see the applicant and they're qualified, get a lease agreement written up in writing from either an attorney, a real estate agent. You can even use some of the pre-filled ones that are online, but I would recommend, finding an agent or an attorney that can help you write up a lease agreement. The other thing that people forget too is you want to have a move-in, move-out checklist. Basically what this is going to do is this is going to summarize the condition of the property when the tenant moves in. That way the tenant, if they break something, that it was the tenant that broke something and it wasn't something that was already broken before. If there's any sort of dispute when the tenant moves out and you take from their security deposit, you have that on paper to show that, hey, look, this item wasn't broken when the tenant moved in. Now that they moved out, the item is now broken. Therefore, we're deducting it from the security deposit. In a court of law, that's gonna hold up way better than, I think this is the way it was when they moved in, or I think, they broke it, but I don't have any definitive proof. Another question I get a lot is, what should you have in the lease agreement to protect yourself? And also, when you're going to rent the property out after the tenant moves out, what are the logistics like? So in my lease agreements, generally, if it's like a 1-year lease or something like that, generally the tenant has to give 1 month's notice, whether or not they're gonna renew or they're gonna move out. Generally, I like to extend that, 3 months prior. That way, even when the tenant is living there, you can actually start advertising the property and finding a new tenant for that property. The other thing you want to have in your lease agreement is liability waiver. So, someone slips and falls, or someone stubs their toe, or, whatever the story is. I've heard all sorts of crazy stuff. you want to make sure that the tenant is not going to hold you as the landlord liable for anything that happens at the property. Someone gets injured, someone gets into a fight, anything could happen, you know, that's life. So, you know, you want to make sure you have a liability waiver. That way they're not coming to sue you, you know, for millions of dollars and you have to hire an attorney. The other thing that you want to have incorporated into your lease agreement is you want to have the security deposit collected up front. So basically what this is going to do is when someone signs the lease, you want them to send you ideally the security deposit and first month's rent. If they're not going to send you both of those, at least the security deposit as a non-refundable deposit for them to hold their spot in line. So let's just say hypothetically, you know, here's your house right here. This is you, you're the landlord. Little Susie comes over here. Oh, she saw the ad on Zillow for your property. She wants to rent out your property. And you're gonna go, oh, okay, sure, yeah, come look at it, come take a look. So you're gonna take Susie on a tour for the property. Susie ends up liking it, you know, she wants to move in 2 weeks, yada, yada, yada. You get the application, you know, she's fully qualified. You get the lease agreement in place. Once you get the lease agreement signed, you know, within 24 to 48 hours, you want Susie to send that security deposit to you as a non-refundable earnest deposit to hold her spot when that lease starts. If for whatever reason Susie finds another property and she wants to rent out that other property instead of yours, she actually has some skin in the game where if she walks, she's gonna lose that earnest deposit that she put in. Make sure you collect that security deposit up front. That way the person doesn't just ghost you and walk. And I've seen this happen before where landlords will have a lease agreement in place, the tenant moves out, the new tenant's supposed to move in within a week of the old tenant moving out. The new tenant actually ends up ghosting them and now the property is vacant and they're losing money every month. They're coming out of pocket for taxes, insurance, the mortgage, everything like that. And now they have to relist the property on Zillow and get someone else to rent it. If the tenant really isn't willing to give a security deposit or anything up front before move-in, you know, that's probably not a tenant I'd want to deal with. I'd want to deal with someone who's a little bit more excited about the property and, you know, wants to put some skin in the game. For the security deposit, depending on, you know, who your clientele is, I usually charge 1 times to 1.5 times monthly rent. In Arizona, you know, it's different in every state, but in Arizona, the limit is 1.5 times. So you can't actually charge more than 1.5 times unless the tenant offers you more than 1.5 times. The other thing that people ask a lot is, you know, who's responsible for maintenance on a property, right? So you're gonna have things that wear out and, you know, you got your major ticket items like the roof, the AC, you know, on single family, stuff like that is really important. The tenant is not responsible for any of the maintenance. So there's little things here and there like, you can make the tenant do the yard work or you can make the tenant, you know, maintain certain aspects of the property. But generally, you know, landlord is responsible for wear and tear maintenance. But if a tenant, you know, they break something or, you know, something happens, they're gonna be responsible for any damages that they cause to the property. So the other thing I wanna talk about is lease duration. So nowadays, you know, renting out a property, Airbnb is super common. So that would be considered like a short-term rental. The advantage to a short-term rental is probably gonna get a little bit more on a monthly basis, but it's gonna be pretty seasonal. So, you know, a lot of the time in a place like Arizona where it's really hot in the summer, you're gonna get a lot of people that come in the winter, fall, spring, but in the summer, it's gonna be pretty dead. So if you wanna do a short-term rental, you need to run the numbers and you need to see, hey, I have enough money to cover those months where it's gonna be a little bit slower and, you know, I might not have as many bookings for July or August, but, you know, the increase in amount of bookings in January and February is gonna offset that. The other thing you can do, you can also do a month-to-month lease. But typically, if you're gonna do a month-to-month lease, you wanna have some sort of upcharge. You know, normally if the property is gonna rent out for $2,500 a month on a 1-year basis, you're gonna wanna charge a little bit more because that tenant can call and say, hey, you know, I don't want to renew my lease next month, and within 30 days they're gone. You have 30 days to find a new tenant for that property. So if you're renting month to month, I would definitely charge, you know, a couple $100 more, maybe 5 or 10%, because you're providing that service to the tenant. You also have your long-term rentals, which are obviously the most common. If you're going to do a long-term rental, obviously you want to have at least a year lease duration in place. That way you know when that lease is coming up. When that lease is coming up, you're gonna list that property on Zillow or Craigslist or Marketplace or whatever it takes and get that property to a new tenant. I would give a discount. If you're gonna do 2 years, you're gonna save yourself a lot of time and also the risk of it being vacant when you're switching between the two tenants. Give them some sort of incentive. Give them 5% off every month, give them $100 off their rent if they sign a 2-year lease. The last thing I wanna talk about is insurance on your property. So if you're not gonna be living in the property and renting out the rooms, if you're gonna be renting out the whole property, you wanna make sure you have a really good, renter's insurance policy. And you can get this from, anywhere online. You can just do your research. You can talk to an insurance broker. There's a lot of different ways you can get insurance policies for your property. Generally, a renter's insurance policy is gonna be a little bit more inexpensive than a homeowner's insurance policy. But you wanna make sure you have that in place. And also you wanna make sure that insurance policy, you want it to have liability coverage too. And if it doesn't have a lot of liability coverage, I would add on an umbrella policy for at least probably $1 million. You can do more if there's more risks on the property. But basically, this is gonna protect you if someone tries to sue you over an injury or something that happens at the property. This umbrella policy is gonna protect you, and it's also gonna pay for, if you have to hire a lawyer to defend yourself in court, it's gonna pay for that. The other thing is you want your tenant to get an insurance policy as well. So what this is gonna do is this is gonna protect your tenants. If someone goes into the house and steals their personal belongings, you as a landlord, you're not responsible for that, right? So you want your tenants to be protected and say, hey, if something happens to your personal belongings, I'm not responsible. You gotta get your own insurance. That way they're not coming to you if, worst case scenario, something happens. So if you have any questions about anything in this video, drop a comment, do everything, like, subscribe if you found this video helpful, whatever. My contact information is below if you want to get in contact with me and you need any help renting your property out. And that's pretty much it.